Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Peter Beinart, a non-resident fellow at FMEP. Today is December 22nd, 2022, and I'm delighted to be here with Jehad Abusalim, who is also a non-resident fellow at FMEP. Jehad is also the Educational and Policy Coordinator of the Palestine Activism Program at the American Friends Services Committee and is completing his PhD in History and Hebrew and Judaic Studies joint program at New York University. His research focuses on Arab and Palestinian intellectual discourse on Zionism, antisemitism, and the plight of the Jewish people in Europe between 1870 and 1948. Jehad, thank you so much for taking the time to do this conversation.
Thank you for having me, Peter.
So the reason I think this conversation is so important is there is a lot of conversation in the United States about anti-Semitism recently, and much of that conversation intersects with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so it often involves a set of claims about Palestinians and their relationship to anti-Semitism, and yet Palestinians are rarely part of that conversation. So the conversation is often about them, but not with them, which I think is often deeply, deeply problematic and leads to people making a set of assertions that I think are just empirically often untrue and deeply morally problematic. And you have actually done a lot of academic research on the question of how Palestinian intellectuals historically have thought about the question of anti-Semitism, of anti-Jewish bigotry. And so I'd love to just ask you to talk a little bit about some of the ideas, some of the currents in Palestinian thought that you found particularly interesting in the course of this research.
Of course, and again, thank you so much for hosting me and for having this important conversation. The Arab and Palestinian engagements with the question of anti-Semitism, the quote-unquote Jewish question, and the oppression and multiple challenges that Jewish communities faced in Europe throughout the 19th and 20th centuries are topics that have been on the radar of Arab and Palestinian intellectuals throughout the past 200 years, especially during the era that we call the Nahda, or the Arab Nahda, or the Arab Renaissance, which starts in the mid-19th century. The Arab world witnesses a revival of the press, publications, engagement with ideas coming from Europe, and commentary on worldwide events in these nascent journals and newspapers that dedicated its pages to talk about political, social, scientific issues, and so on and so forth. So the Nahda was similar to the Haskalah in certain ways. And as early as 1869, this is in the very early stages of the Nahda, you find the engagements with this discourse of European anti-Semitism that is packaged and repackaged in its modern forms and making its way into the Arab world. So for example, and this is where my research starts in 1869, where in Beirut, this book, a booklet actually, a small book published by an anonymous author, promoting the accusation of blood libel. And the pioneers of the Arab Nahda, Butros al-Bustani and his son Salim al-Bustani and other intellectuals and leaders, they waged this powerful campaign asking Ottoman authorities to confiscate this book and to search for the author and to basically end the existence of this piece of literature that they found disgusting and ridiculous, and they published in multiple journals, multiple articles and engaging with this text, refuting its content, refuting the accusation of the blood libel, and talking about Jews in positive terms, and emphasizing that Jews have an important place in their vision for an equal society that is rooted in their early ideas of citizenship, what equal citizenship looked like, based on equality between members of different faiths, religions, and so on and so forth. Another example from the late 19th century was when Al-Muqtataf journal paid attention to a debate that was taking place between a notorious Canadian-British anti-Semite whose name was Goldwin Smith, whose name is still, by the way, on one of Cornell University's main buildings. And there was a campaign a few years ago by some of Cornell's Jewish alumni asking to remove his name from the university. Goldwin Smith was obsessed with Jews. He would write these articles, saying all sorts of nasty things about Jews. And the person who would become one of Britain's chief rabbis, whose name was Rabbi Herman Adler, responded to Goldwin Smith. And the Arab press picked this debate and sided with Rabbi Herman Adler and highlighted how the Jews were defending themselves against these accusations. So in the early Nahda era, we have all of these examples. And then, moving into the early 20th century, of course, Palestinian intellectuals and thinkers were second and third generations of the Nahda, were influenced by this thought. They come from this tradition that was generations that were excited about the European Enlightenment, about excited about scientific advancement and progress, humanism, universal ideas, and Palestinian intellectuals, like other Arab intellectuals, were talked also about these questions now in different contexts, right? They have Zionism being introduced as this powerful force in the politics of the region, and at the same time, there were events such as World War II, which I can talk about in detail later on. So we have all these examples of how Palestinian intellectuals engaged with ideas such as Nazism, fascism, and how they basically made the case against those ideologies. So there are plenty of examples.
So maybe we should talk about Palestinian reactions to Nazism and the Holocaust. I think the one thing that many Jews will know is the Mufti, Hajj Amin al-Husseini meeting with Hitler, and so I wonder if you can talk about that, but also put that in the larger context of the variety of different Palestinian reactions to Nazism.
Of course, a lot of scholars have written about that particular moment of when Muhammad Amin al-Husseini made that calculation, met with Hitler. I'm not going to comment on Netanyahu's accusations that Hitler was so inclusive that he gave Muhammad Amin al-Husseini the opportunity to share ideas with him about how to proceed with his evil plans. But I think one of the problems I face as a Palestinian historian, as someone who does this research, is that the assumption that Muhammad Amin al-Husseini was that the Palestinian people were this massive tribe, and Muhammad Amin al-Husseini basically represented every Palestinian in his decision, although he was in a position that the British created. Palestine didn't have a mufti before the mandate. And he made that calculation during the war. And of course, a lot of Palestinian scholars and historians and Arab scholars and historians, condemn that and talk about it in that context of, early years of the war, not fully grasping the scale and intensity of what the Nazis were doing. And of course, at the end of the day, for me as a Palestinian, I'm looking at a diverse society, a society that had a rich political atmosphere, and a variety of groups, of schools of thought, of political parties. Some were leftist or communist, others were liberals, nationalists, others were, Islamists, and the lines, the gray areas between these different schools of thoughts and backgrounds were very blurry. And there were different kinds of positions that Palestinians adopted during the war, like any other society around the world. So while there were people who, unfortunately were excited about what was happening in Europe, or I wouldn't say excited, I would say they used the logic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There were also Palestinian intellectuals and leaders who condemned Nazism, who condemned fascism, even during the early stages of the war. And I think one of the most important books that were published during the early stages of the war, while the Nazis were achieving victories on the European front, was a book called Islam and Nazism, Do They Agree? By a Palestinian author who was called Muhammad Najati Sidqi. And Muhammad Najati Sidqi is a fascinating character because he was a key leader in the Palestinian Communist Party. He was assigned with the task of Arabizing the party and introducing it to Palestine's Arab population, making it accessible to the population. He went to Spain to fight against fascism, and he played an important role in producing anti-fascist propaganda during the Spanish Civil War to call upon soldiers from North African origins who were recruited by fascists to abandon the fascist cause. And then he returns to Palestine around the late 30s, returns to the Arab world and publishes this book in Beirut, basically making a moral, philosophical case against the Nazi ideology. So he's not really concerned with, diplomacy or whether World War II will be harmful for Palestinians or not, regardless of what kind of geopolitical considerations will come out of it. He was concerned with the immorality of the Nazi ideology and how it opposes what he calls Arab and Islamic values. Although he was, a communist, he still viewed himself as part of this Islamic Arab civilization with its sets of values and traditions and philosophies, that he saw himself as someone who inherits that, and he saw Arabs and Palestinians as people who inherit that. So he goes on and makes the case against Nazi ideology, condemns tyranny, condemns the dissolution of the individual in the sea of fascism in favor of worshiping a tyrant, and talks a little bit in his book about I think, people talk about Orientalism, Edward Said's book, as one of the early works that challenged the use of education and academia and scholarship and media in enforcing Western dominance. But Muhammad Najati Sidqi also talks about what German institutions were working to disseminate Nazi propaganda in the Arab world, and he basically, goes to the Quran and to the Hadith, the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, and he highlights all verses and all sayings by the Prophet that basically show that Nazism is an evil ideology that Arabs and Muslims shouldn't adopt. Another example was the work of the Palestine Broadcasting Service, which was headed by a guy named Ajaj Nuwayhed, who basically dedicated the Palestine Broadcasting Service to disseminate pro-Allied information during the war. And I think one of the most important interviews that were held by the organization, that were an interview that was then, the transcript of it was published in the Palestinian press multiple times, was an interview with an Egyptian poet and writer named Abdul Qadir al-Mazini, who basically also makes the case against Nazi and fascist ideologies, and highlights this idea that our traditions as Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians and Egyptians do not agree with these ideologies. We come from traditions that value hospitality and generosity and aiding the weak and assisting the vulnerable. And what is happening in Germany and Italy is something that does not agree with us civilizationally, and we're more like the Anglo-Saxon. He tried to highlight that part. So I think there are plenty of examples that of engagement with these ideologies, but unfortunately they're not highlighted now. And one of the ironies that I have came across in my work is that due to the Nakba of 1948, Palestinians lost touch with this tradition, with this intellectual tradition, because we lost our newspapers. Now some of them are digitized by the Israel National Library. And the Palestinian library was looted and destroyed during 1948. So there is a lot of important work that we need to reclaim and highlight.
So I'm curious how Palestinian intellectuals thought about the relationship between anti-Semitism and Zionism. Obviously, if you look at Zionist thinkers, or Pinsker, Herzl, there's an intimate relationship between anti-Semitism and Zionism. The argument is, well, the Jews are not going to be safe in Europe, therefore Jews need a country of their own, and the only place that most Jews really will want a country of their own is going to be what Jews call Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, so therefore political Zionism. And I'm curious, as Palestinian intellectuals looked at this relationship between anti-Semitism, the way anti-Semitism becomes fuel for Zionism, how they thought about the interactions and what alternatives they suggested to this problem.
This is an important question. I think I will mention two examples from two different eras. In 1919, a group of Palestinian intellectuals formed an organization in New York called the Palestine Anti-Zionism Society, and they wanted to basically contact the big powers, mainly the British, during the peace conference following the end of World War I, and promote the idea of greater Syrian independence. For those who are not familiar with this concept, after the First World War, one of the ideas that were very popular for the fate of the region was the establishment of a larger Syria, independent larger Syria, including what is today Palestine, Israel, Syria, and Lebanon, Jordan. And they published a book, an anthology that included writings by well-known historians and activists and scholars, including Philip Hipti and Khalil Totah and others, to talk about the future of Palestine. Basically, the title of the anthology was The Reconstruction of Palestine. And one of those authors talks about this. His name is Habib Katiba. He was Syrian from the city of Yabrud, studied at Harvard, and lived between Boston and New York. And he basically says, in short, that gathering Jews in Palestine will not solve the Jewish question, will not solve anti-Semitism, because he looked at this issue in a broader way, in terms of, number one, the roots of hatred against Jews in Europe, that combining them in a country will not make them safe so long as this hatred continues. And at the same time, this is an inhabited country. There are people there. So by bringing Jews into Palestine and establishing a state for them, which he called then a new kingdom of Israel in an already inhabited land, and denying will result, and I'm talking about a text that was written in 1919, bringing those people and will result in denying the native population their sovereignty, their rights, and their ability to live with freedom and dignity on their own land. And this will cause another clash. So for them, they rejected that idea, and on basis of these two notions, that we need to look at anti-Semitism and the Jewish question as part of a greater effort to fix the world that we live in. There is racism, there is colonialism, and we also need to, and a question like that cannot be solved by creating another question of denying people their dignity and independence and sovereignty. Fast forward to 1945, another intellectual from Gaza, his name was Saadi Bseiso. He writes a book in which he talks about and imagines what the future of an Arab independent Palestine will look like. And without further explanation, he basically says, Palestine and Britain need to sign a treaty, and partition is a pretty dumb idea, and Jews can stay. For him, it wasn't a foreign idea that we live in a society, in a country where people come from different faiths, especially when it comes to Palestine. This wasn't a foreign concept or something that was out of this world. So I think there were different ways they approached the question of anti-Semitism and its resolution. And I think, as I said in the beginning, the idea that this is a global issue that needs to be solved on a global scale, and then Palestinians shouldn't be the ones who pay the price.
I'm interested in the commentary and at the time, and also how you think about the question of the Jews from Arab lands and Middle Eastern lands in general, who leave their countries, in some cases are forced from their countries in the late 40s into the 50s, and many of them go to Israel, although some go to other places. So oftentimes when I hear Palestinian discourse, I often hear Palestinians talk about anti-Semitism as fundamentally European, as a European pathology. And yet, as you know, many Jewish Zionists tend to point to the flight of the Jews, the Mizrahi Jews, as examples of what they claim is the pervasiveness of anti-Semitism in the Arab world. Essentially, if there wasn't a lot of anti-Semitism in Morocco, Iraq, Egypt, Yemen, etc., those Jews would have been able to stay. So I'm wondering how you think about that moment in make sense of it in terms of the question of anti-Semitism in the Arab world.
Of course, I think the Zionist enterprise and its work towards establishing the state of Israel didn't happen in a vacuum. It came to a region that was still figuring out its future. People were still figuring out multiple questions, including the question of citizenship. What defines a citizen in Arab society? Under whatever visions for national independence that will take place. There was a question of colonialism and how colonial powers utilized and used sectarianism to further its agenda. There were also questions related to class and the place of different religious minorities in these societies. There were also questions related to identity, questions related to religion. And I think one of the most important issues and that we need to go back and revisit and read about is the question of religion, the role of religion in defining vis-a-vis the question of citizenship. And I think scholar Osama Maqdisi he wrote an incredible book about this, and he's been writing about questions of sectarianism and intercommunal strife, and also attempts towards coexistence. So his latest book, The Age of Coexistence, and writing about the ecumenical frame. So Zionism comes into this complex scene and says, well, we are going to create a state for Jews, and it's going to be a Jewish state, and only Jewish people are privileged in this state, and it's a state that, despite that it claims to be secular, it derives its symbols, its culture, its outlook from religion, and at the same time, Zionism says that we need to end exile. We need to exile is, the whole idea of the ingathering of exile and rejection of the diaspora. So this causes a huge problem in this complex scene. And of course, as an Arab and as a Palestinian, I believe that Jews from Arab and Muslim countries have the right to go back to the countries of their origin. But at the same time, Zionism says they don't belong there. And they made Aliyah to their only legitimate homeland. So there is an inherent contradiction within Zionism itself. So before Zionists come to Palestinians and Arabs and say, let's talk about this, I think there is a conversation that needs to happen, within Zionist circles. They need to decide, do Arab Jews and Jews from Islamic countries belong in these societies, or were they're on a temporary exile and then they return to their native homeland? So that's one issue. And I think in 1948 represented a massive rupture for all of these processes to configure and reconfigure questions of citizenship and belonging and identity. And it definitely caused a lot of tension across sectarian and religious lines that were pretty unfortunate. But if there is a campaign tomorrow to advocate for the right of return of Moroccan Jews to Morocco, Algerian Jews to Algeria, Iraqi Jews to Iraq, I'll support that campaign. But at the same time, there are Palestinians who are dwelling in refugee camps for 70 years. And I don't think it's fair to use these examples conveniently to assault the Palestinian right of return, given how important it is for Palestinians, especially because of the difficult conditions that they live in right now.
Yes, I think you're making a very important point, which is that, as you know, many kind of Israeli government and pro-Israeli government figures, whenever the question of Palestinian refugees come up, they want to link it to the question of Arab Jewish refugees. But as you say, if then one responds as you do by saying, terrific, everyone should have the right to return to the places they were from, then it actually shows that the whole thing is kind of a ruse, right? Because in fact, of course, that's not pro-Israeli government figures are not interested actually in Moroccan and Egyptian and Iraqi Jews going back. What they're interested in is basically them forfeiting their right to go back, as part of the Palestinian refugees having to forfeit their right to go back, right? one of the issues that I imagine Palestinians have wrestled with is the question of what actually is the relationship between Zionism and Judaism, or Zionism and Jewishness, right? That it's a complicated relationship. In some ways, Zionism grows out of Jewishness, but in some ways also represents a repudiation of certain traditional aspects of Jewishness. And I'm moving forward to the era of the PLO in the in the 60s and then into the 1970s. I know there was a lot of research that was done associated with the PLO that about the question of Jewishness and its relationship with Zionism. And I'm curious about how Palestinian intellectuals and activists thought during that period about the relationship between these two things.
Yeah, I think one of the most important examples of post-48 visions for what life should look like in historic Palestine was the one-state manifesto that Fatah and other forces within the PLO adopted in the 60s, early 70s, before they adopted the program that would prioritize autonomy on a liberated piece of land of historic Palestine. And that manifesto, it's available in English. People can go read it. One democratic state for Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And of course, Palestinian leaders and intellectuals always commented in public forums and the writing that, we're Palestinians separate between Judaism and Zionism, and we have to distinguish. And whenever there is a writer or a leader who repeats, superficial lines about Jews or Judaism or Zionism, other intellectuals come out and remind them that our conflict are with a political movement, a colonial movement. It's not with the Jewish people. So I think, and even leaders of Islamist movements like Ahmad Yassin, who founded Hamas, he also reiterated that line multiple times. He said, if a Lebanese occupies Palestine, I'm going to fight him. If an Egyptian occupies Palestine, I'm going to, something like that. So I think there is this, this idea has been pretty, I grew up hearing that. And at the same time, I think it's important to highlight that Palestinians are asked to be the nicest occupied people in the world. And I think, for ordinary Palestinians, they live under occupation, they live under oppression. Every detail of their lives is complicated and violent and exhausting, and there are symbols that are put in their face every day to remind them of what project is taking place in their country, and whose narrative is the only legitimate narrative in this country, the sole narrative, and whose history is the only history that needs to be highlighted, while other histories need to be dismissed. So the Palestinian resentment, Palestinians resent these symbols, they resent these ideas, they resent the institutions that work on promoting them, and they also have to deal with the daily violence that is practiced against them. So I think, and so whatever attempts we have towards nuance, I think, sometimes it can be challenging to promote this nuance while this violence is being committed in the name of these symbols and in the name of this narrative and in the name of these ideas that says this is a Jewish state for the Jewish people, and only Jewish history, Jewish culture, Jewish symbols are relevant, and the rest doesn't matter. So I think it's hard to navigate that. Let me tell you one story about how I personally had to deal with this. I took a Hebrew course. It was Hebrew for journalism or journalistic writing. And the teacher, there were two main topics that
you took this back in Gaza, where you're from, or here?
In the US. in the US. And the teacher was, and I studied Hebrew in Gaza before, so I can't talk about that. But the teacher was highlighting two topics in her teaching, two kinds of articles and readings that we read. One, the first topic was the Holocaust and its legacy. The other topic was German culture, beer fists, everything Germany. So for me, I was new in the US. I was, you know, I wasn't really sure like what was going on. So I went to her and I asked her, and it was an innocent question on my part. I said, so you're teaching us rightly so about the Holocaust and about all these crimes that the Nazis committed in Germany and beyond. And at the same time, you have this interesting obsession with German culture and things German. And as someone who comes from the region, you know, like, I wonder why aren't you teaching things about, you know, like the region in Hebrew? So she basically said, the German people did their homework, but the Arabs didn't. And I'm still baffled by the answer, meaning that, you know, that there is some sort of an exercise regarding what was done during World War II that Arabs have to atone for. So I don't know. It's pretty fascinating.
I mean, I think you're making a really important point. It seems to me probably inevitable. I mean, if you think about the way that Jews thought, and still many do talk about Ukrainians or Poles or Latvians or Lithuanians, right? There was a lot of negative views about those peoples, right? Or the way some Black Americans thought about white Americans, or Black South Africans thought about white, right? Sometimes not a clear distinction made between, you know, a political regime and the larger group of people in whose name that regime speaks. And so that can turn into, you know, a generalized hostility to that entire national or ethnic group. And so on the one hand, one needs to perhaps recognize that that is going to be almost inevitable, while also recognizing that it's problematic and regrettable. And I would, because you mentioned Yassin, I would be remiss if I didn't ask about the first Hamas charter. And its use of the protocols of the Elders of Zion and other. How do you explain that particular, especially given what you said about Ahmed Yassin, the spiritual leader of Hamas, who was making a clear distinction? How does it come that in the first Hamas charter, the two things get conflated?
Absolutely. The protocols of Elders of Zion were, if I'm not mistaken, were translated after 1948. And they became popular after 1948. In a moment where people were trying to make sense of defeat and make sense of what they perceived as this Zionist power that doesn't make sense. How the transformation of an entire country overnight, the defeat of multiple Arab armies, and the rendering of hundreds of thousands of people refugees who were unable to go home. The scale and intensity of that event was unprecedented in the Arab world. And this isn't to justify the dissemination of such, you know, literature. And it's ironic because one of the people who translated the protocols of Elders of Zion was an arid anti-Nazi, anti-fascist activist during World War II. And I will leave this. It's a painful conversation to talk about. It's a painful story. It's still under research. So this person basically was crossing into West Jerusalem to go home, and he was told, "Come back tomorrow," and he was never able to go back. So there is this obsession with this literature that emerges after the Nakba. And of course, not everyone took it seriously. And fast forward to the 70s and the 80s, the context in which a movement like Hamas emerges in the West Bank and Gaza, mainly Gaza, it is important to look at what cultural life looked like then under a regime of heavy censorship. Magazines, books, pamphlets, political discourse, political conversations, political discussion. There was none of that under Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza in the 70s and 80s. Educational institutions were suffering. The Palestinians were cut off from the rest of the Arab world. And add to that also the post-1967 defeat. So if 48 was a major defeat, think about 67, which also represented a larger defeat in terms of morale, because there was this massive pan-Arab project represented by Abdel Nasser that was secular, that was promoting, a lot of secular values and education and so on and so forth. So the defeat of that project opens the way for the dissemination of such literature too. There is an emotional and a psychological, there are psychological and emotional factors behind why people who are cut off from the rest of the world, who don't live in a place with a thriving cultural and literary scene, can resort to such literature. And I think, if we have a time machine and go back to Gaza in the 1980s, people I wouldn't say they would understand, because of course, the incorporation of something ridiculous like the Protocols of Elders of Zion and the Manifesto of a Political Movement shouldn't make sense. But I think understanding that context will explain why something like that made sense for these people. And of course, the charter has been updated. It's been changed, and I think they abandoned the Protocols of Elders of Zion in 2017. So even, so that's another thing. Palestinians in their political entities and their political worlds, they also have the capacity to grow and evolve and change. So I think, we're still, people still use the Mufti while dismissing all the other examples of Palestinian resistance to anti-Semitism, to Nazism, to fascism. And I think these obsessions aren't constructive in making sense of the Palestinian experience and why people make certain choices. But I also believe that they're most of the time are brought up in bad faith. So what's the use? What's the benefit of continuing to engage with these arguments?
Yes, I mean, that brings us to just in the last couple of minutes to talk about the present moment. I mean, I myself find myself often with a certain ambivalence about the American conversation about anti-Semitism, because on the one hand, I mean, I do think there are some worrying things that are happening in American culture that I did not expect. And certainly as a Jew, I wouldn't never want to be in a position of not taking my own safety seriously. And yet I find that a lot of the conversation about anti-Semitism, when it engages with Israel-Palestine, is predicated on the kind of dehumanization of Palestinians, or kind of predicated on the idea that bigotry against Jews is bad, but bigotry against Palestinians is normal and acceptable and invisible because it's simply taken for granted. And so it becomes not a fight for Jewish equality, but essentially a defense of Jewish supremacy. And I'm curious for you, how would you like to see the conversation about anti-Semitism integrated into a broader conversation that also centers the struggle against this massive, brutal, institutionalized bigotry that Palestinians experience?
Of course. I think whether we like it or not, Palestinians are in a fight, and they have to continue fighting against white supremacy and against institutionalized racism. And I think these are the main forces that continue to promote anti-Semitism, in addition to all sorts of bigotry and racism and hatred against Black, brown people, Muslims, people of color, Jews, and so on and so forth. And there, in the movement for Palestinian rights in the US, there are always conversations, public or private, about how to talk about these issues. And like I said, I think Palestinians are expected to be the nicest occupied people ever. But despite that, you know, we Palestinians who are fighting for their rights, they also, many of them subscribe to bigger struggles that want to see a better world. And I think for me, that's one of the reasons why I'm writing this history, because I want to tell my fellow Palestinians that even during the height of the mandate and the height of British and Zionist oppression of Palestinians in the 30s and in the 40s, and before and after, there were voices that were committed to challenging these evil ideologies on moral and principled basis. And I think our opposition will continue to repeat the lines that they repeat, unfortunately. But I think I myself, I receive a lot of accusations every day on Twitter, but I disregard them, because at the end of the day, we need to look forward. We need to...
You mean accusations of anti-Semitism?
Of everything, including that. But we need to push forward and continue with telling our story, telling our narrative, and fighting for a better future. And I genuinely believe that the question for Jewish emancipation and the fight against anti-Semitism cannot be separated from other questions that I'm concerned with. First of all, the question of Palestinian freedom, but also the question of freedom and democracy in the broader Arab world, the question of citizenship, the question of human rights and human value and human dignity. And until we figure out these questions, until we resolve them in ways that challenge forces of tyranny and injustice, one question of oppression will not be resolved while others are pending. And that's very important to remember. Because if in the Arab world today, we want to resolve the plight of Arab Jews who, whether they left by choice or were forced to leave their countries, this cannot be done without addressing the questions that relate to citizenship and equality and tyranny and despotism and democracy and equality in the Arab world. And I think the Arab Spring tried to do that, but with the setback that it suffered, I think a lot of these questions are more relevant and important now. So it is this broad vision, and it's this broad way of thinking that I think we need to highlight and center in the coming years.
Yes, I think that's so powerful. I mean, it reminds me of, Martin Luther King's famous line about being connected in a single garment of destiny. I think one of the things that I find deeply upsetting is to see the way in which anti-Semitism now, in, let's say, the figure of the special envoy against anti-Semitism, is not only used to discredit support for Palestinian human rights, but is used now as to become an apologist for Arab dictatorship. So you go to Deborah Lipstadt goes to the UAE and she goes to Saudi Arabia and she pats them on the head and says, oh, they're good now because now they're saying they're against anti-Semitism, right? As if that should be, as if even if we took that at face value, as if that would be enough to excuse their brutal oppression of their own people, right? And as if somehow the safety and freedom of Jews can be segmented off in this region or in Palestine, Israel from the safety and freedom of Palestinians and Arabs. Jehad, I'm really grateful for you to taking this time. It's a fascinating history that I really hope that you are successful in kind of bringing to broader attention, because I think that all of us need to understand this history much better to have a more intellectually serious and also a more ethical conversation about these different forms of bigotry that exist.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. And thanks to our listeners for tuning to this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website at fmep.org for resources related to this podcast and lots of other rich content related to Palestine and Israel. And please make sure you are subscribed to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify, and you can also watch video versions of our podcast, including this one on YouTube. And with that, I'm Peter Beinart signing off until the next episode of FMEP's Occupied Thoughts.